so let's take a quick look at the internet weather for the week here. And we'll start out by taking a look at port 58455 TCP. And this is one that we've talked about recently. So in the graph I'm showing here, actually 90 days of data, because I wanted to show the last time that we reported this. This is back in around the about the third week in February that we had reported activity on this port previously. And but we've seen a revival of activity on this particular port over the last week or so. And it's scanning activity. There's just scan probes on this particular port. And what we're seeing is a diverse set of source countries that are associated with this scanning activity. But you know, China actually appears to have the most sources. So it's kind of an interesting diversity. It suggests perhaps a botnet, that when you look at that sort of diversity, that it suggests a botnet. And in fact, it's likely associated with the Zollard botnet. This is one that's associated with basically devices that are being exploited. I think predominantly Linux-based devices, is that right?
Right, yeah. Other embedded types of devices, similar to some of the other activity we've seen, but maybe some, it's actually interesting in that the embedded devices that they target here, as part of the exploit payload, it'll actually bring down binary payloads for ARM, MIPS, right. All the various versions of these embedded devices for their underlying architecture, and then it'll try to figure out which one is the right one and run that one on there.
Right, right. So, and actually, that was that's this deep research site. This is an article, I think, that, or a blog that was posted back in December 2013, where somebody had identified this. And I think we actually referred to this a previous time when we reported on this back in February as well. You pointed out there are different types of architectures that they include in the download, or at least availability for download. He also mentioned the x86 architecture. So if you just have a Linux box that happens to be exposed, he's able to exploit that as well. And what this person also observed was that it opened up this port. There's a 58455 on the device, and then proceeded to scan out looking for others. So presumably it's looking for others that have included this backdoor. It's not exactly clear what the objective is for those devices, but clearly they could be used for just about anything. Next item here is scan probes on port 1080 TCP. This is SOX. And we've seen some relatively consistent, or off and on scanning activity on this particular port. So I wouldn't describe this as really earth-breaking news here, but the objective here, if you have a SOX server, you can use that as a proxy to get to other systems and do it in a more anonymous way than you'd be able to do it otherwise. So there is some sort of potential malicious motivation for doing this, that is identifying SOX servers. And what we're seeing here is a number of the sources are also showing steady. That is, the number of sources that are doing this scanning. Looking back over the last 90 days or so, we've seen some increase in activity, but it's not, it's not a significant increase in comparison to what we've seen here is much more aggressive probing activity from some certain sources here.
Is there any particular part of the world that this scanning is coming from, or you didn't get a chance to check?
I think actually in this particular case what we were seeing is a lot of it from the Netherlands, but I'll have to double check that and make sure.
Okay.
Likely we'll be reporting on this again sometime in the next week.
Well, we've got our homework assignment regarding this one as well,
We've also got
right?
another homework here. Next item here, and this goes right into the Heartbleed topic. This is probing on what I described as SSL-enabled ports. And John pointed out earlier that there are a number of ports that have SSL-enabled functions associated with them. I didn't attempt to try to map those to specific applications. Jim had mentioned some associated with mail applications a little bit earlier, but 443 is one that's well known, but some other ports that if you're looking for this type of activity, you're going to want to check a number of other of them: 465, 563, 636, 695, 898, 989, 990, 992, 993, 994, 995, 20. Oh.
Pike. Sorry.
Thanks. And 2083, fumble. 2087, 2096, 2484, 8443, 8883, and 9091. So of those, what I basically did is picked out the ones that we saw the most probing activity on in our data. So a lot of these, there wasn't really any significant amount of probing activity that was recognizable, but there certainly were some significant spikes that are worth talking about here. And what I did is, in this case, a relatively rare exception, is focused in on the last 15 days because there is enough little intricacies in this graph that it gets a little washed out if we look at the big ones. First of all, it's important to note, and I think we've reported on this frequently in the past, is there is frequent probing or regular probing activity that takes place on port 443. So you can see the bumps that's shown in the green here, all port 443 probing, not necessarily for this particular event. Clearly, once the information about the Heartbleed incident was disclosed, we saw some increased activity. So whereas we saw spaces in between time periods in the 443 activity in the past, clearly this was starting to fill in as the Heartbleed incident was disclosed. And then, as we see here, there are some other ports that started to show up, and actually some significant spikes in probing activity. And some of these in particular are 8443, which actually shows, it's actually quite small here in the blue at the bottom side here. Port 465, that is the red spike that we see here. Port 995, which is the light green that's showing in the back. And then we also see in the tan, which is 587. And then there's one additional one, 993, which is actually these big spikes of the cyan type or light blue color. So significant activity that seems to a large extent died off over the weekend and continuing into this week. So hopefully most people have gotten their legitimate probing out of the way to identify potential vulnerable sites. And I guess we had mentioned or wanted to mention earlier that, if you're probing for sites that might be vulnerable, make sure you're only probing your own sites. That, other organizations, if they're seeing you probing, they don't know whether you're probing for some good reason or whether you're actually performing some malicious activity. So, and they might want to take action against that. So only probe your own sites for the potential of the vulnerability. And another one related to this, in terms of scanned sources that are doing probing on port 443, I thought this was kind of an interesting observation that right around April 11th, showing here, and then more recently on the 15th, we saw some significant spikes, and not huge, but significant spikes in the number of sources that were probing on port 443. And I don't think it's a coincidence when that occurred. What this is very suggestive of is a botnet that has been basically activated to do the scanning. And these spikes and the number of sources are actually very attributable to sources in China. That is, it popped up in the order of around 800 or so sources that were doing this probing. So it's highly likely that there's maliciousness associated with this in terms of intent. This is clearly not probing their own sites because it's coming from China and going around to other countries. So most likely associated with and very aggressive, covering a lot of address space. So most likely associated with some sort of malicious activity. And not just simply doing a good thing to identify vulnerable sites. Next item here is to look at the 10 most probed ports for the week, and top of the list here are port 22. Next in line, port 23 TCP, 445, 3389, that's remote desktop protocol, port 5000 TCP, and this is one that we had associated with the, help me out here, John, this is the disk manager application.
Synology Disk Station Manager, I think, something like that.
So the port 5000, 23, and 22, we generally associate with the Internet of insecure devices that are being exploited and used in botnets. Port 80 TCP and then 123 UDP, that would be looking for NTP servers, network time protocol servers, to be used in denial of service attacks, which is dying off. We'll do a little bit of an update on that next week. And then 443 TCP, no surprise about that one, and then 8080 TCP. So what we're going to do is take a look at the most sources probing here. In this case, again, far and above the others, port 23 TCP, followed by 445, port 80, and then we also see some of the P2P activity for that continuing to die off zero access botnet. I wanted to give a little bit of a composite update here as a final item of the activity that we're seeing associated with this probing activity on port 22, 23, and port 5000 TCP. And basically this is looking back at the last, excuse me, 120 days. And you can see where, we had sort of this norm of activity that, around 90 plus days ago, and then started to see a ramp up on port 22. Saw this bump of activity on port 23 that joined into the fun, and then eventually saw a significant increase in the scanning activity on port 5000. And we've referred to a number of times this sort of sawtooth behavior that we've seen on port 5000. You can also see it on the port 23 activity as well. So clearly this is activity that's associated with this botnet. And you can even see, as the port 5000 picked up, there was sort of a drawdown in the activity on port 22 and 23, with emphasis on port 5000. That looked like it was a sweet target to go after for these folks and to capture more devices. And clearly this activity is going on. It's no less of a concern than it was before, even though there may not be as much probing. There's a good possibility what they've done is they've partitioned off the botnet. They're using it for some other activities. Jim, you had reported about the activity doing Bitcoin mining on these devices as well, right?
Right. There was some evidence of some of the malware that was infecting some of the devices that were doing the scanning that would also do the Bitcoin mining.
All right. So we've seen in the past, we've seen these used for denial of service attacks, Bitcoin mining, click fraud has shown up relatively recently, and anonymizing proxies.
Right. And phishing websites. We've seen
phishing
some
websites,
isolated cases
Absolutely.
where they'll dump a fake phishing page on these compromised devices and then point some dynamic DNS at that IP.
Yeah, so no good coming of this. And this is something that we're going to continue to try to work and see if there are some deterrences that can be put in place.